So here's our social and political protest key areas, which we're going to try to apply as ever to Blake's poems. We're going to look at a couple of poems here today that look at young people and Blake's depiction of how their lives perhaps should be and how they are sometimes not. So there's issues of power, of control, of human organisation, possibly of gender politics as well, and social class here. We'll see authority, the challenge to authority, as being central as ever to Blake's vision, and ideas of suppression and oppression, the patriarchy featuring the position of women being a focus. In terms of methods, we'll have one quite straightforward poem with perhaps slightly elaborate but rather straightforward metaphor, and then another poem that's a little bit more dreamlike. Both poems have an element of political protest that's perhaps stronger than in some of the others, and a clear focus on what's being protested about, particularly in the first, the schoolboy. So as we look at the questions that have been asked in the past, we'll have some chance to look at perhaps personal relationships, particularly in the second of the two poems, and authority, certainly, the human spirit. Religion hovers in the background of the second of the two poems, especially. Escape and constraints, and parental oppression is implied in the first and is more explicit in the second. And that sense that there is joy and innocence that's possible in the world is there in both poems too. So the schoolboy is our first of our two poems, and this is the most simple and direct and a really useful summary of some of Blake's positions, and so one that you would well be advised to know pretty well, and therefore go forward expecting to turn to it in the exam. Because what you have here is a fairly straightforward poem that depicts a child's desire to be free out in the countryside here. The countryside, as it often does, particularly in the innocence poems for Blake, seems to represent freedom, liberation, natural innocence, the way things should be, the way things perhaps were in a distant past, in a sort of Eden-like prehistory. And how from that first stanza, where we see everything is very upbeat and free and liberal, we then see the contrast in the second stanza with that ominous but to go to school, and how all joy is driven away. And here we have the image of the authority under a cruel eye outworn, a great line to use to depict how Blake sees authority over children, but probably authority of all kinds, really. And so sighing and dismay, drooping. Learning's bower sounds now like a sarcastic depiction of what learning could be, a sort of beautiful setting of, sitting amongst the trees and in a sheltered space in which learning takes place. But no, here it's a dreary shower. So the imagery is very straightforward, really. And then we have in the fourth stanza the bird sitting in a cage. And again, it's the idea that nature should be freed, should be let fly, human beings should be given their freedom, children should be given their freedom. So it's back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his idea of the sort of natural goodness of human being, which is destroyed if we intervene too much and try to control those natural instincts. And Blake seems to be very clearly on the side of those who are liberal and believe in freedom and want to give children, and then by implication everybody, the freedom to live their life as they wish, to follow their natural instincts, which are good. At the conclusion of the poem, the metaphor is a little more complex, but is still fairly straightforward, that if you nip the plant in the bud, if you take away the potential for flowering, if you sort of control the child too much and limit its sense of expression and creativity, then it will not have anything in later life to draw upon. It will have no chance to flourish, which is a metaphor we use a lot anyway, to describe growing up and doing well in our lives. Well, that's going to be denied if you tear off the buds, you tear off the potential for flowers, and there's no resources to draw upon in the winter, in the later part of life. You've got nothing left to turn to. So education in this context should be about storing up riches of experience and understanding, and these things will take you through life and help you to live a rich and fulfilled life. But if education's about a sort of narrow and limited and controlling force, then we'll be left with nothing to go forward to in life. And so the best education for Blake would be the natural education of getting out and experiencing the world as it really is, and being free to play and to enjoy and to communicate with the natural world. So it's a great poem to summarise a lot of what Blake believed, taking children and school as a metaphor really for the whole of his beliefs about authority, and therefore this is about escaping constraints. And he suggests there might be an escape from constraints, but he also, the poem ends darker, as if those constraints are quite hard to escape from. It's not about parents, it's about children, though, and therefore, by implication, the parents who've sent the child to school, there's an oppression and control there that's implied. Religion isn't really mentioned in the poem, but again, the implication is that the true religion, the true belief of you should be to foster the belief in the natural goodness of human beings, and not to kind of attempt to control and constrain that. The human spirit has power to resist. Well, the child does resist. This is a child's voice speaking to us, and they are resistant to this oppression, but how far they're successful is not clear. It's not particularly about marginalised people, this, although it might be by implication that people are drilled into conforming to a central way of life, and that therefore there's no space for the marginalised in this society. If you are marginalised, it's because you won't conform, and therefore you're pushed out of all possibility of flourishing. The personal relationships in this poem are the relationship between the teacher and the child, and they're not very conducive to any kind of hope or harmony. So authority here is, we have the absolutely perfect example of the authority that's cruel and unkind. Under a cruel eye out warm would be our key sentence. Joy and happiness and innocence are there in the first stanza, and then kind of sapped out of the poem after that. There's quite a lot of rhyme in the poem. There's those interesting but fairly straightforward metaphors, much simpler metaphors than, say, a poem like The Human Abstract, where the metaphor is dense with complicated possible connotations. Here we can unpick these metaphors very quickly. They have a directness, and therefore it makes it much more of a simple message-based poem, more of a protest poem, if you like. The imagery is about contrast between the joy of the summer morn and the blasts of winter. So the first and last line there offer that strong contrast. Well, it's interesting that the poem is a 5-line poem rather than a 4-line poem. Many of Blake's poems are 4-line poems. But this has this fifth slightly odd line, which creates a 3-rhyme structure. And you could argue that might be part of the poem's attempt to say something's not quite right here, something's odd, something's intervening in the neatness and completeness. That could be the child's voice intervening in the neatness that the school wishes to impose upon it, or it could be that things are not right because the child is ill at ease. In either way, this is a good example of Blake's a very direct style, and his most direct and the most memorable. Let's compare it then to another poem that's got some similarities. A Little Girl Lost. There are 6 different girl and boy lost poems. Some are them, some there. This one, A Little Girl Lost, appears late in the original copy of the Songs of Experience. And it doesn't bear much resemblance to the first 2 Little Girl Lost poems or any of the Little Boy Lost poems, because it has a particular focus. It's about um, young people and their romantic inclinations and their sexual desires, and it's about liberty, freedom, the free love, if you want to call it that. It's saying that young people should be free to pursue their romantic interest in each other, and they should not be sort of chaperoned and controlled and forced to perhaps wait till marriage before they can experience sexual intercourse. Um, so it has a very particular political message, and therefore, like the Schoolboy, it is saying something that is a clear protest against restriction. So where the Schoolboy perhaps about younger children, this probably about teenagers, and it's again a good example of why perhaps Blake's poetry became very popular in the 1960s, in that age of testing boundaries and challenging authority and the liberal attitudes amongst young people to free love, as the phrase was used a lot in the late 60s in America and Britain. We have this slightly strange opening though, children of the future age. So it's like a sort of prophecy, which in fact the first of the Little Girl Lost poems began with that too, this sense that it was a prophecy of some sort of future. But here it's the indignant page, a good protest phrase there. In former times, love, sweet love, was thought a crime. So very clear in that first stanza what he's trying to say here, that there was this kind of puritanical attitude to sexual love, which was restrictive and said, you know, you must not do that, you must not experience intimacy until perhaps marriage, and certainly not at a young age. And then we get a little sort of story. It's told in short rhyming lines. The first stanza has 4 lines, and then he goes into the 5-line stanza after that. And we get these children, he calls them young people, we're not quite sure how old they are, youthful pair, so teenagers presumably, not young children. We've got a maiden and a youth, so again, suggesting sort of virginity there and inexperience. And they meet and they are naked together, slightly coy, doesn't quite describe the sexual act, but then you wouldn't perhaps expect that of a poem of that era to be very explicit. But we have the sense that what they experience is something he approves of. It's the softest care, it's the bright garden, the holy light. All these things are mentioned to seem to give a ring of approval, and there's something almost sacred is happening between this young pair as they met together for their romance. They play, the parents are far off, nobody comes near, and then we sort of get a gap at the end of the 4th stanza. We don't have exactly what they do together, perhaps quite rightly, he keeps that rather private, and then we get they're tired with kisses. So having kissed each other until they are tired, they then decide they're going to meet again in the evening. Now at the end of the poem, the girl, who's given the name eventually of Ona, it's a slightly odd name, I don't think particularly a name that children had in his day, but the father's white, and often this sort of white hair and beard is seen as being an image of decrepit old age and sort of unsympathetic old age, a bit like the nurse in the Experienced Nurse's song. So he looks like the holy book, so he has a kind of religious aspect, I suppose, like a sort of godlike figure, and he shakes with fury, really. And he talks about his dismal care that shakes the blossoms of my hoary hair, and that's it. That's the end of the poem. So he just furiously is angry that his child has met with a young man and exchanged kisses and perhaps more. Blake, again, in a slightly odd depiction there, that fits with the very dreamlike depictions of the earlier Girl Lost poems, where a girl strays and is rescued by a lion, and the whole thing takes a sort of cartoonish aspect. But Here, it's closer to a sort of more realistic scenario, but it still has a certain oddity about it. And that's reflected perhaps in the slightly odd structure of the poem with the short lines, the 5 lines rather than 4. Everything's a little bit off kilter, a little bit coy to say exactly what it's about as well, perhaps. In an age of censorship, he didn't want to annoy potential readers too much. But ultimately, he has a similar message to what the poem that we saw a minute ago, the Schoolboy has, which is let young people experience life, let young people be free, let young people follow their own emotions, let young people do as they feel is right to do. And so emotions and feelings and your instincts are good, and it's against a kind of puritanical, limiting, restrictive view of the world and of human interactions. So you have no escape from constraints. Well, there isn't an escape in the end. We don't quite know what happens. His poem seems to finish before we know how the father is going to perhaps try to limit and constrain the child. The parents here, we do have a sort of oppressive, controlling parents. So that question, the second of the questions set on the course, would have been a good one to draw this poem into. Religion isn't mentioned directly, but it's implied that it's some kind of religious belief that is leading the father to be so resistant to the child's desire to experience life. The human spirit here is resisting to some extent, but it's not quite clear how far that resistance will be successful. And personal relationships here are not empowering and liberating entirely. They seem to be potentially between the young man and his maiden. The two seem to liberate each other, but the parental figure seems to clamp down on that. And so we have that unkind and non-compassionate authority figure here again. And so their innocence has led them to joy and happiness, as the last 2024 question suggested, but it hasn't been sustainable because of the interference of authority figures. So the two poems together that we've looked at here both give examples of how Blake is challenging authority, speaking up for freedom in a pretty direct way, but this one, second one, has something more of a dreamlike quality about it that makes it slightly less easy to march to the beat of, if you like. It's not got that slogan-like quality, apart from in that first stanza, really. From that point on, it becomes a little bit more confusing as to whether this is a realistic narrative or some kind of parable. But either way, the message is relatively clear that restriction and restraint are not what Blake favours. He wants freedom, liberal attitudes to sexuality, to young people and their ability to do what they want to do. And in both of these poems, he's spoken up for that. The implication being, again, that our instincts are naturally good. And so, two very useful poems, I think, if you're looking at a range of different approaches to Blake, but fundamentally his challenge to authority and his pursuit of freedom.